So, as everybody gets ready for the holidays and sitting around the table and eating and cooking, and whether it's in person or in Zoom, however you're going to do it, we hope that you do jot down some of the stories, because that's one of the most important things about family history is those stories and passing on those stories. Even if we don't do or find that actual document that we're looking for, those stories can keep our family alive. And Sam, our colleague, as I mentioned, from the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, for those of you that are unfamiliar with our locations, we have three separate special collections. The Clayton Library is our genealogy collection. We have the African American Library at the Gregory School in their own separate building, and then where Sam is at the Houston Metropolitan Research Center in downtown Houston. And Sam has a Bachelor of Science in Historic Preservation from Southeast Missouri State and a Master's of Arts in Folk Studies, Historic Preservation track from Western Kentucky University. And since 2015, she's been the architectural archivist of the Houston Metropolitan Research Center of the Houston Public Library. And in this position, she oversees the Stephen Fox Architectural Archives, which houses over 80 collections, including 10,000 projects from Houston-based architectural firms and projects completed within the Houston area. She's conducted and assisted on many oral history projects while pursuing her degrees and in her time at the Houston Metropolitan Research Center. Sam, welcome to Clayton Library Presents. I don't know, have you been here before, Sam, in the times that we've been doing anything?
Only in non-COVID times, in-person programming. So thank you for having me in the new age.
In the old days in person. I am going to stop sharing my screen, hand the screen over to Sam. There is, I'm imagining, Joy, the link to the handout in the chat, and then any questions that you have for Sam, please do put those in the chat and we will get to them at the end. So Sam, you got control.
Okay, so today I'm going to take you all through some of the basics of not only just general best practice for how to conduct oral histories, but really a focus on multi-interview projects that you kind of have to plan out and, put a little more in-depth timing in too. But to start us off, a few things about what oral histories are, including some key elements that they all share, and just a couple of different types of interviews that you may want to pursue. Starting off with definitions, everyone's favorite thing. David Caruso defines an oral history as a primary source material created in an interview setting with a witness to or participant in an event or way of life for the purpose of preserving the information and making it available to others. More simply, Willa Baum, a pioneering oral historian from California, said the goal is a good historical account, firsthand, preserved, and available. Some additional key elements are defined in the Oral History Manual by Summers and Quinlan. That book is available at Central and at Clayton if you're local. But there are some points to all of these definitions that I'd like to highlight. Mostly like an interview setting, firsthand accounts, and that they're made available. All are important aspects for a good oral history and an oral history project. Making the history easy to understand and detailing the events in a way that just can't be captured in a document or an image, or even in newspapers or later news recordings of the time. The making the recordings available to researchers and just general users or family members is also particularly important because it just carries that information along and gives people insights into an era or a topic that otherwise they might not know about or not know how it affected people directly. So there are two primary types of oral histories that you may want to pursue in your project. So there's biographical, which is the most commonly thought of. When you think of an oral history, It's just an overview of someone's life from the beginning to where they are now. But there are also some focused types of interviews that cover the basics, their name, date of birth, but then they really move on to focus on the interviewee's experience with a specific event, place, or topic, World War I, World War II, growing up in Houston, growing up in New York City, just any kind of topic you can think of. And you can tailor your project to suit either one of those types of interviews, or really a blend if there's, things particular to a certain person that you want to highlight. So deciding which type of interview to capture is one of the most important steps to consider in your pre-interview process. So I've highlighted some here that we'll kind of go over throughout the presentation, mostly here at the beginning. And we'll go into those more deeply. And again, if you have any questions on the specifics more than what I go into, please let me know at the end in the chat. So your first step is determining the purpose of your project. Why do you or your organization or your religious group want to record oral histories? What are the goals of the project, not just at completion, but along the way? Are you planning to document an organization's growth over its history, capturing high school memories for a class reunion, or just preserving family stories? How many interviews are ideal for your project? Do you want, two, one with, a grandparent, a grandfather, grandmother, or do you want, a whole high school class? You need to kind of have at least some basic guidelines for your project at the beginning. That'll definitely change as you go along, but kind of an ideal and also like a minimum that, we really need to keep going. We need to find more people. You also need to make a plan for what to do with the interviews once you're finished with your project. Will you keep them within the organization? Are you kind of collecting them for yourself? Maybe you're writing a book or a family history. Or, ultimately, of course, in my field, I'm going to advocate for donating to an archives, library, historical society, somewhere that their purpose is to capture and preserve these materials for future generations, and maybe people outside of your initial focus group. So you also want to kind of set a topic and scope for the project that kind of complement your purpose. Use this to determine who would be best to interview, taking into consideration their relationship to the topic. Do you want different perspectives? Do you want people who all had one job? And also take into consideration their age and current health. You may find that, people recommend someone highly, but unfortunately they're suffering with dementia. Ethically, you're not going to want to, interview that person unless, that they're completely lucid at the time. And, just make sure your topic is not too broad, that it gets muddled down, or too specific that you're not going to get any information, that you're only sitting there for 10 minutes and that's all of the recording you're going to get. So it's ideal to do research at every stage of your project before, so you learn some of the names, the big players, and then kind of along the way to fill in the gaps, to learn what hasn't been documented before and, what gaps you can fill in with your project. You can do this, again, advocating for us, visiting libraries, archives, historical societies, to use some of the materials that they have in their collections. But again, that'll get you some information that you might not otherwise get. And you may find that something has been extensively documented and you kind of want to move on to a different topic or different focus for that topic. Also, you might want to have you should really have a pre-interview discussion with your selected interviewee to determine how many or how they were involved, their comfort level with specifics, and again, how clear their memory is. And then also any other people that they, think you should talk to. But really, before you can talk to them, you need to find them. So the next step is interviewee selection and contact. In your research, again, you'll find relevant names in those primary and secondary sources. Also, hopefully, you're working with a group of people who are at least vaguely familiar with the topic, and you guys can kind of brainstorm names of people that may be interested in participating. And then you can kind of, again, ask those people, as you get involved with them, as you get to know your interviewees, use those as connections to other people. Contact the potential interviewees by phone, email, or letter. If it's a family member, you can do an in-person chat or a call. But if it's someone you're less familiar with, or you're kind of reaching out to blindly, sometimes it's better to use a formal letter. Also, if they're not familiar with technology or comfortable with it, that'll be the best approach. In that correspondence, you're going to want to explain who you are, what group you're working with, if that's relevant, and what your project is about. Not just I'm collecting oral histories about World War II, but this is our goal. This is what we would like you to contribute, and this is what we're going to do with it. Make it clear that they will be recorded, and that your preference is video over an audio recording or vice versa. Some people would rather their voices be recorded than their image. Here at HMRC, when we do oral histories, we prefer video interviews. It provides a little more in-depth look at people's emotions and body language that you don't get to capture in audio. But we will do audio only if that's the interviewee's preference. Also, make it clear that your plans for the recording are not just for now, it's also for the future. And any potential donating the materials to an archives library, because all of these things they'll need to agree to and sign a document saying that they've agreed to those terms. Again, ask them if they know of anyone who would be interested, and any topics or questions that they think are important to your project. It may be something that, an angle that you hadn't contemplated before, or, lead into a whole different area and focus for a project or a sub-project that you're going to use going forward. When you set up your time and location for the interview, try to defer to their preferences and needs as much as possible. They're recording their narrative that they're giving you as a gift, and you should be appreciative of that and try to work with them as much as possible and stay on their terms and good terms, of course. Once you've confirmed who your interviewees will be, you can start your outline of the interview, how you'd like it to go, write your introductory statement, and draft some questions. So your introductory statement will be how you begin the interview. So for an example, this is Samantha Brewer. Today is December 3rd, 2021. I'm interviewing John Kirby for the first time. This interview is taking place at his home, 234 Robindale Street, Houston, Texas. This interview is part of the Hopewell Organization History Project. So this statement will introduce your project to the interviewee, but also any people listening in the future. And you're going to use the same basic statement at the beginning of every single recording for the project, just interchanging the relevant details, the name. If you're interviewing them for the second or third time, that's important to highlight too, so that people know which, oh, maybe I should go back and listen to the first one because this is the second time. And really at the actual recording time, it lets your interviewee know, hey, we're getting started. This is, it's go time. For your questions, try to think of things that are talking points rather than just questions you have to ask because they're on your sheet. Um, you want to have some core questions or topics ready on a notepad. I always take a notepad when I'm doing oral history. So I have kind of a vague outline, but then I can write notes, things to confirm, the spelling of names, if they said this name and maybe they really meant this person. I'm not going to interrupt them during the interview, but I'm going to try and follow up with them and see if that's what they meant, see if that's what they actually wanted to say. But then you're also going to use it to kind of jot down questions that you think of. As they talk, you're going to think of new things, think of new areas to ask about. So you don't want to have just a static list. You want it to be able to grow during the course of the interview. Make sure your questions are open-ended so that you don't just get yes, no answers, especially if you have someone who wants to participate but is kind of clamming up. So what were your feelings towards going overseas rather than were you afraid to go overseas? Because, especially for a young veteran, at least at the time of their deployment, they're probably going to say yes, or they're going to be a little more matter of fact about it. Remember those 5 W's that somehow strangely include an H: who, what, when, where, why, how. Those are going to help you ask those open-ended questions. Know that you may not get to all your questions. You can always do a follow-up interview if they're agreeable. But it may, you may find that they answer it in another location, or they, make enough of an attempt to answer it that, it's not really worth pursuing. As far as setting up the logistical details of the recording of the time, the date, location, you should plan the interview to last an hour to an hour and a half. It could be shorter, but you definitely don't want to go much longer than an hour and a half. People get tired of talking, especially, not that every recording is going to be with someone who's elderly, but, you want to be considerate of their time and, making sure they don't get tired. And then adding at least a half hour before and after that maximum oral history time. So you can set up, tear down, and the inevitable conversations that are going to play into you getting there and working with them as you get started. And again, plan for multiple sessions if possible, or if they don't feel like they can go on that day due to their age, their health, even their emotional status. Some people get very emotional, understandably, and you want to be respectful of that. So location is often key. You really need a quiet location, and really highlighting good lighting for video interviews. Many locations are a little louder than you'd like, with traffic going by or other family members in the house. So while interviews are often conducted in the interviewee's home or office, they might not always provide the best environment for an interview. Make sure you are close to electrical outlets when you're there. You can always, in your initial phone call to them and follow-up phone calls to them, you can ask about their outlet situation or if they have room preferences, because those are important details that you don't think about sometimes until you're there, and then you regret it. And during that, also for location, you're going to want to make sure you have an alternative. If their house or office or any other location that they choose doesn't seem like it's going to be a quiet space or an easily accessible space for both of you, try to come up with an alternative location that will provide those parameters that you need for a successful interview, to be well recorded and comfortable for both. And then when you start to capture the interview, make sure that you can hear them, as I said, with a quiet space, but also that your equipment is able to capture their voice based on its tone. So that kind of leads us into the next area, which is the equipment that you'll need. So the next few things are always a little more interconnected, but the type of equipment you need really depends on your budget. So at minimum, you need a recording device. If that's a video camera, audio recorder, some people even just use their cell phone. That's not ideal, but it can definitely work. Preferably, you would have a microphone outside of just like the built-in video camera, microphone, audio recorder microphone. It just gives a better audio quality, but it's not necessary, but it does make a difference in the way you hear the interview in the future. So in the handout, I saw Joy put in the chat, and it was on the Clayton website earlier before the presentation. There's a link to a website called Oral History in the Digital Age. And that has recommendations for equipment at most price points. I think it starts at under $100 and goes up to like multiple thousands of dollars. So, you know, it's accessible to anyone, especially if you have a cell phone and you just want to go that route. But, you know, those are things you might want to consider depending on how many interviews you do and what kind of preservation you want to have at the end. But whatever equipment you choose, make sure that you have extra batteries or a plug. I prefer a plug-in situation so that the primary means of power is electricity with a battery backup. You want to avoid equipment failure during the interview at all costs, obviously, since it's inconvenient to both of you. And, you know, preparing will keep you, you know, hopefully from avoiding that, or keep you avoiding that. In a similar vein, make sure you have gotten familiar with your equipment before you get to the interview site. You don't want to be learning what you're doing there in front of the interviewee. It makes you look unprofessional, no matter your relationship to them. And, you know, you may do something wrong and then lose that entire recording. So you want to make sure you know what you're doing, make sure everything's set up right, and make sure, triple check that when you start recording, the equipment is on and ready to go. So as I mentioned, much of your budget or much of your project depends on the budget. Donald Ritchie, who's kind of the go-to guy on oral history, at least early on, says that a budget balances your objectives with your resources, and that is absolutely true. You can't have a budget of nothing or $150 and expect to have the best equipment or be able to, you know, interview people across the country. You know, some people do remote interviewing, especially in the COVID age. But that's really a whole different ballgame. So you kind of want to avoid that if possible, because it's always better in person. For people and groups new to oral histories, the equipment and the technology needed for the recording and preservation of the interview will be, you know, really your biggest area of expense. Ideally, you'll have that nice camera, a recorder, a microphone, but also computer storage, cloud storage, external storage, and maybe a few other places. You will also need to work out a budget of your time based on how many people are involved in the project. You know, you need time to plan the project, research, reach out to interviewees, do the actual interviews. And then there's also, you know, saving things after the interview and then some kind of use, you know, the goal of the project. What are you going to use this material for? You know, is it part of a larger project, or is this kind of the completion of everything, is just getting these recordings gathered? And also in this is travel. You know, can you travel? Do you have the budget for that? Do you have the time for that? Can you drive to all the interviewees? And again, in this is kind of, you know, maybe having to rent a space or reserve a space to record an interview if you don't have another available space. One of the most complicated and important issues, legal and ethical concerns. So oral histories are copyrighted at creation under US law. So before they can be used or distributed, that copyright has to be transferred from the interviewee to the collecting organization, person, or project. You can do this through a consent form, and there's a few examples in that handout or links to examples. And there's lots more available just through a quick Google search. And this form really covers the details of the project and what you're expecting of the interviewee, and that they agree to participate, they agree to relinquish their rights to this recording, to this particular recording, not their general story, and that they're giving it to the project or the sponsoring organization. And hopefully it will also cover the future use or placement of the material in an archive or other institution. Really, what happens to the recording after the project is over. So, it's possible and fairly common for an interviewee to want to put some restrictions on how their interview can be used. Sometimes it's, please don't release this until after my death, or I'd prefer to go over the final product before it's released. Those are within their rights to, I won't participate unless I can do these things. But you have rights too. You can choose not to interview them. So these are things that you're going to want to go over with them in the pre-interview discussions. You don't want to find this out the day of the recording that they have qualms about releasing the material or giving it over to you. So you kind of want to discuss that beforehand as much as possible. Things are always going to pop up. But you don't want to sign the document after they've written restrictions on them and then go back on your word, because that's legally messy, ethically messy, and just a whole thing that you don't want to go down. I will say that a common practice and just a common courtesy is to let the interviewee review the interview and or the transcript after the recording. They may choose at that step to redact things. They may have said something not so nice about, a family member or someone else. It doesn't happen very often once you give that to them. But, they're sharing their story. You can share a copy of the recording. So once you've worked out all the logistics, the dates, the budget, equipment, and where you're going to be recording, you're ready for the interview. So we'll go over some points to try and make that go as smoothly as possible and be a successful event. So on the day of, you're going to arrive at the location. You're going to want to take note of a few details. For video recordings, they're going to look for the lighting in the space. Is it too dark? There may be a different area in the home or building you can use. And sometimes you can even move different lights or furniture around in the space if they're agreeable to that. Are there electrical outlets nearby for your equipment? Plugging in the equipment, of course, will help to avoid any dead battery interruptions. And that's always best to avoid. So you're also going to want to check your equipment once you get there. I'm sure you've checked it the night before, you've checked it before you left, but you're definitely going to want to check it when you get there on site. A professor of mine always used to call them the gremlins that would inevitably mess up something. So you're going to want to make sure you've triple checked everything and are ready to go. Setting up your microphone or just your phone, whatever you're recording on. You're going to want to do voice checks to see about the levels. On a lot of recording equipment, red is bad, green is good. as far as how easily you can understand them, but also how loud they are, how well it's capturing their voice. It's okay to lower the mic if they're just a really loud talker. And then vice versa, you can either pull it closer or farther away from them, or, on a more complicated piece of equipment, adjust that mic strength. Also for a video only recording, you'll want to frame them about mid-chest or shoulders up. You don't want to, you can do a whole body view, but most people are comfortable, with mid-chest up. That really, you can really capture their facial expressions and you have a good tight view of their face. And then, you're not getting all their hand motions and everything. Inevitably, you'll get some, but it's a little less distracting. And with non-distracting, try to keep the background fairly neutral, so people aren't, their eyes aren't drawn away from, the person and their story, by a cool figurine or something in the background. Keep yourself close to the camera, but not in view, again, for a video recording. So I always do it just directly to the side, so they can look at you and they're not like directly looking into the camera and staring at the person who's watching it 50 years from now, and looking slightly creepy. And it helps to feel like they're having a conversation, even if they're the primary one talking. So it kind of helps to put them at ease, and the future watcher is at ease. Also have your consent form ready to go. If you don't sign it before, you may forget after, and then that's a difficult situation to be in. You'll either have to go back or, hopefully you can just email it to them. You want to have that ready to go. That covers your bases, and that means you can use that recording. If you don't have that, you've really lost your ability to make that usable. It's really easy to forget, and if you donate it to a library, archives, whatever, you're going to need that. So the archives will need that, and you'll also need that for your project. And ultimately, right before you start recording, you're going to want to make sure your interviewee is comfortable, and that you have water or tissues handy. People get emotional when they're telling their stories, and particularly, you're probably going to breach some difficult topics, and you want to, be prepared for that. So as you start your recording, make sure you're clearly stating, I'm going to start recording, I'm going to stop recording, so they know, like when they're mic'd up, and when their stories and conversation is being recorded and potentially distributed. You shouldn't ethically use it when they don't know, but that's why you want to be clear in letting them know when it's going. So I always have my notebook ready to go on my lap, and at the top of that, I always have my introductory statement exactly as I'm going to read it. And kind of towards the bottom, I have a way to sum up the interview, or a last question to ask, and then a reminder to thank them, because they are giving you their story. During the recording, try to remember that it's their story, not yours. Try not to insert your opinions or assumptions, and really interrupting them and derailing their train of thought. Also try to limit what I'm doing today. Lots of ums, likes, and other verbal tics that you commonly use. You can encourage them and agree to things with a head nod or a smile, that don't interrupt the recording as much, especially if you're going to transcribe things. It is horrible to break up conversations like that and try to capture every word, and it really breaks up people's conversation, and it can kind of throw them off course as well. In the story, then their narrative overall, Try to keep them to a chronology if you can, but understand that, they may forget dates, they may say the wrong date, and that people love to go on tangents. Something will remind them of something else. Sometimes those are the best stories that you get, but also, for your project, for your topic goal, you really want to kind of have a way to redirect them back after a while. Try not to lead with your questions. As I mentioned before, try to keep your assumptions out. Try to keep, those questions, those topics neutral and as open-ended as possible. And again, as I mentioned, develop questions or points based on what they're talking about. So don't fret if you don't cover everything you'd like. You may get another chance to record them, or someone else may talk about something more in depth, and then you kind of have that documentation as well. A general tip is maybe to have some photos, documents, or other like tangible things that they can point to and may spark a memory. And if it's during a video recording, they can show on camera. Depending on the angle of your project, they may also be comfortable with donating it or donating a copy of those materials as well. As I mentioned, try to limit the number of times you cut into the story. So here on the screen are two examples from the exact same interview where the interviewer was great and bad all in the same day. So on the don't column, you can see that he's done several of the things that we've talked about not doing. So he's asking questions or doing statements that kind of lead to yes and no answers. You're answering the question that they've asked, but that's not what they're looking for. So you kind of want to, give them the opportunity to expand. He interrupts the interviewee a lot, especially during this whole section of the interview. So the interviewee is just stopping to gather his thoughts. It's clearer on the actual recording for this interview. It's a brief second that the interviewee stops talking, and then the interviewer is jumping in immediately. Oh, like this? Like a cotton gin? Maybe it wasn't a cotton gin, and then they have to, oh no, not a cotton gin, but a cotton mill, something like that. It's probably the same thing. And then at the very end, he makes what I think is one of the biggest faux pas. Is they're talking about the interviewee's father played the violin, but he had a different job. So the interviewer says probably he played the violin only for his own pleasure. And then the interviewee says, I think he played parties and different things like that, and kind of goes on to say, actually he was, he did a lot of amateur musician things. He was, actually quite respected and known for his music. And it seems like at least that the interviewer is kind of not belittling, but making light of the man's contribution to the area in the music scene. And then again, further along in the same interview, he gets a lot better suddenly. So he asked, what opportunities did you have outside of school to play? And then the musician, who was a professional musician, Milton Larkin, he goes through a long narrative of detailing exactly, where he got to play. And there are no interruptions. It makes for a clear transcription, and it makes for a clearer recording overall. So as you move towards the end of the interview, don't stop recording until you both start moving around, because inevitably there will be something they remember and they just start talking. Often as soon as you hit stop recording. So you're like, oh, wow, that's a really great story. I wish you'd told me that a minute ago. Do you mind putting that on the record? And then you have to start, and then they'll tell the story again, and it's never as good as the first time they told the story. Because then it's practiced. They've already done it. It's not it's definitely still as interesting, but it doesn't have quite the same punch that it had the first time they just happened to mention it. So don't worry about kind of, let them know, oh, we're finishing up, I'll let you know when I stop recording. But in that meantime, kind of have it playing. You can always edit that at the end as you start to process at the end of the recording. You can always delete that section, but you can't ever get it back if you miss something. But when you are definitely finished, pack your equipment carefully, make sure everything's turned off, that everything seems to be in good condition. Thank the interviewee for their time, and make sure to return their house or business into the, make sure it looks the same as when you got there. If you've moved any furniture or lighting around, be considerate of their space. And again, if you forgot the consent form, get that signed then, and confirm any follow-up dates, or let them know that you'll get back to them about follow-up dates, so then they know the way forward. And after the interview, they might be done, but you are not. You'll need to work on preserving the recording and completing your overall project. So as soon as possible after the interview, transfer your recording off the original equipment to something more stable. We often use the term locks with 2 S's. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. It's recommended, at least in the archival world, that you have the raw recording, which is directly what you pulled from the recording equipment. You have that, a preservation copy. So once you merge everything together, if you happen to have a couple clips, there are some free softwares out there, or things that come pre-installed with some computers. Once you've been able to stitch those things together, you want to keep one copy as your preservation copy. That's the one that you never touch. You keep it backed up on all these things, but that's your go-to. The thing that you're going to use in promotion of this project, in providing access to other people, is your access copy. It's just a direct copy of what you have, sometimes of a lesser quality, and not lesser quality as far as, so there's like a WAV versus an MP3 file. Some are a little more, I guess, stable. There's not much difference for most people to hear in audio, the quality of the audio. But as far as, it's able to play on more devices, and it's a smaller file for people to access, that's the one you're going to want to not manipulate, but use, and, maybe chop into clips for your project as well. But key to all that is that you want to save the material in multiple locations and across different formats. So a flash drive, an external hard drive that you can plug into your computer, a cloud backup like iCloud if you have Apple products, Google Drive. There are multiple, actually probably endless subscription services and free services that you can use as cloud backup. And having those, the physical materials in different spaces as well, like one at your organization headquarters, one in your home, in case, God forbid, something happens, you have multiple copies, and you can, ensure the safety of the recording. If something goes bad, is damaged or accidentally deleted. Also make sure that your file names are consistent and include the name of the interviewee and date of the recording. If you're bad at file keeping, this is not where you want that to happen. You may lose the file just by, letting the computer choose the name, or whatever recording device you used. Make sure that you change the name of the file to something that, shows it is this recording on this date. So for your interviewee follow-up, you're going to want to make sure to send a written thank you to your interviewee. preferably just a handwritten thank you note, old-fashioned, but it works and it lets them know that you have valued their time. It can definitely be an email if that's what you're more comfortable with, if that's, something they commonly use, but sometimes handwritten is best. Make sure if you haven't before, plan any needed follow-up sessions with that person. And, they, may, excuse me, once you've completed the transfer or completed the transcript or an index, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, you're going to want to share that with them. So if they have any qualms about something they said, they can see what they said, they can listen to what they said, and let you know if, that's something that they really don't want to be shared. It's not ideal. You always want to, keep everything, but, you also want to maintain a good relationship. And it is a best practice in the field. So speaking of transcription and this indexing, you're also going to want to organize any notes you took. All three of those are easiest to work on as close to the interview as possible. So the topics are fresh in your mind. Names are easiest to remember. You haven't lost your notebook where you wrote out the spelling that they used. You capture some of those things that, maybe there's a bump in the audio, something that you didn't quite get, there you can have in those other records. So transcription is probably what people think of when they think of an oral history in word form, some kind of document to go with an oral history. And while it is the most in-depth, it's pretty much always a word for word, as accurate as possible, transcription of what was said in the interview, by whom, and kind of the details of the project at the beginning to kind of place it. And while it is the most in-depth, it's starting to not go out of favor, but be used less frequently, particularly in libraries and archives. Mostly because transcription is very time consuming. So roughly 10 to 12 hours of work to transcribe generally takes at least 1 hour, or excuse me, backwards. 1 hour of audio from your recording is about 10 to 12 hours of work transcribing. And that's if you don't come across difficult words, have to make some judgment calls following your language standard. So do you want to record every Some people do. Some people think it's important. That's going to add a lot of time. Figuring out how many they said, especially if they do a quick that's the way people talk. And translating that into word form is sometimes very difficult. And you're going to want to have a standard for that. And anytime they misspeak, I would hate for someone to transcribe what I'm talking to you all about right now, because there would be lots of stops and starts, and how would someone document that? You need to keep that consistent between interviews, especially if you have multiple interviewers. Make sure everyone is using a standard language. Going back, another thing with transcription, these get used more often than the recording when they exist. You don't have to worry about someone posting it online. You don't have to worry about getting the access copy. If you can find the word-based document, you pretty much have the recording. But you don't. In archives, we treat, the transcript, if the recording no longer exists, that's kind of your primary source document. But really, the recording itself is your primary source. This is someone's interpretation, however good, of what happened. So you're going to want to go to the recording, and so many people don't if you have a full transcription. Which is why there is this kind of newer alternative, which is indexing. So in indexing, you do summaries of topics using timestamps. And when they switch topics, you're going to want to make a new kind of a new heading. You can here see family genealogy, ancestors with ties to colonial America. And then, and 9 minutes in, she's talking about train travel in the American West. So you're going to want to have a theme or a general title for each section. And then you're going to write a little more thorough synopsis or summary of what's discussed in there, and the timestamp so people can kind of jump through the interview. If they're not interested in their genealogy, they just want to know about trains, they're going to jump 9 minutes in and maybe, miss all those other things that, they're not interested in. And that's great, but, it's always going to take someone away from the interview if they're not watching the full thing. Indexing really relies heavily on people with, computer access, the recordings being online, so you can click through them. So people in lower technology settings, or even people in like the hard of hearing community, they might not be able to access the full oral history in this way. So, it's a judgment call. Neither way is better or worse than the other. One takes longer, one takes less time, but each offer, distinct advantages and disadvantages. Really, the choice is for you and your project collaborators to decide and stick with. You can do both, but really you're going to decide one or the other. So the final item I'd like to very briefly cover is a few ways to use and promote these recordings as part of your project. You can record or you can create websites based on the project, based on the recordings, and then embed the entire interview or just clips onto the website. A few sources that all have at least partial free access or Mecca, WordPress, SoundCloud, and you can use those for websites and or uploading the recording to. You can use newsletters for your organization or group to interested parties in paper versions using quotes that you've transcribed from the recording. But in digital newsletters, you could link out to a website or link out to social media where you actually have a piece of the recording and make it a little more interactive for your end users, for your really the people using your recordings, hopefully in the way you see fit, and branching off from that into ways you didn't expect. As far as social media goes, Instagram in particular lends itself well to promoting and sharing oral history recordings. Some projects and oral history centers have pages only on social media. They obviously have backup storage, but that's the main access point. That's kind of their website for their project. But you can also use the recordings in exhibits, classrooms. Teachers are often looking for ways to incorporate primary sources into them, and what better way than a video recording or an audio recording to get kids to understand something from, or adult students looking at things from a new perspective when they actually get to hear about someone's experience firsthand. And also a newer angle is podcasts and then traditional presentations. But overall, it's really up to you, and you can decide what to make your project be, and any residual growth you get from that will kind of grow from there. So many avenues you can take, but hopefully the ideas we talked about and the things that we talked about have you thinking of the possibilities for your project. Thank you all for coming today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. My contact information is here on the screen. So if you have any questions outside of today, please let me know. Thank you.
Sam, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. So it was really great to understand how, the bigger picture. So if all of us are involved in organizations or have some other, church groups or things like that. But
Mhm.
the interesting thing about your presentation I found too is everything that you talked about could be, and I don't want to say watered down, but could be, sort of lesser involved for a one-on-one interview, like sitting at the table, but still,
Mhm.
the planning and the idea of questions and knowing what you're going to be doing, as opposed to, as I talked about at the beginning, just sort of that impromptu recording of people sitting around the table.
Yeah.
So being prepared, I think, whether it is just a one-on-one and we're going to talk about, so if I said to you, tell me about your experience growing up in Southern Illinois, and then, I would listen to that, but know that that's what I wanted to talk to you about,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And then if I was unfamiliar with Southern Illinois, you would think that I would do a little background of it. And so I could maybe ask you about some things that went on in Southern Illinois. Is that really kind of, some ideas that you have?
Yeah. Yeah. You want to know that it's mostly hilly, not all flat, like the rest of Illinois. Um, you don't want to go into something completely ill prepared.
Mhm.
You want to have some kind of basis for what you're doing, and you don't want to do something that someone has done over and over and over again. 'Cause you're not adding anything. You might get someone new's perspective, which is always a good thing, but you're not contributing to the overall,
Yeah.
subject matter that
Mhm.
you're discussing.
Mhm. And that's important even on a, on a one-on-one family type of situation too. We're talking about, we're applying what you gave us to larger groups and then also to a one-on-one, I mean, you're going to want to know if you're going to want to talk to your father. And I think that many of us on this presentation today wish we would have talked to people.
Mhm.
So, and let's talk about even interviewing yourself, Sam. To get some history down, as we look for other people, when you talked about finding people, don't
Mhm.
ignore yourself, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's always going to be hardest, at least in my experience and in talking with others, it's always hardest to interview people you're closer to. So I imagine, a self-reflection is going to be a bit of a mess for yourself at times, but when someone gets upset and they're your family member, you're going to be upset with them, whereas at least if it's a stranger, you're able to step a little bit back of,
Mhm.
keeping a bit of, if not professionalism, then that common courtesy. Whereas, if it's your grandma, you're going to jump onto the couch with her and give her a hug. Um, but,
Mm.
anytime you're going to document the stories, I kind of focus at the beginning on the two types of oral histories, biographical and topical focused. Really, that's not the only kind of recording you can do, you should do. As Sue mentioned earlier, my master's degree is in folk studies, which is folklore. So capture family stories, capture family, pet peeves, anything. Um, that's that's as important as, what they were doing on D-Day when they stormed the beaches, you know.
Right. And it's also, so, and, when you talked about, making sure, preserving the recording,
Mhm.
even at the level that you were talking about, we still, if we're doing an individual family type of thing or something like that, we still need to know, what are we going to do with this stuff, whether it's our paper stuff, whether it's a recorded stuff, what's going to happen to all this? So that even extends itself to these oral history recordings, whatever they are. So in asking one of the questions, and there are some questions from the chat, but as we're talking about this, Suzanne asks, she's representing her high school class for class reunions with all the classes from 1959 to 1970. And she said, how would it be to have a booth for people who wanted to answer a question like, what's your favorite memory of growing up, you know, in wherever in the 1960s, and do you think it's worth the effort? So what actually, how do you decide maybe the value of the time that you talked about investing for oral histories? And then in this world, maybe talk about where that kind of stuff would be kept.
Yeah, we do similar things here at HMRC. We generally call those memory projects. When you're asking, it's like the most focused of all focused interviews. You know, 1 or 2 questions that you're asking multiple people, you know, maybe 5-10 minutes per recording. You know, that's valuable in itself. Maybe, you know, ultimately you only distribute you know, a compiling on a CD to the participants of that event, but then they get to go back and reminisce, and then conversations are happening that, you know, wouldn't be prompted otherwise. And, you know, those are things compiled like that, that even as a one-off, archives and historical societies, particularly in that area, well, definitely in the area, are going to be interested in. Some may be reluctant to take something that's just a one-off, but overall, you know, that's
Mhm,
documentation of a time period and of a group of people that, you know, that's what we do, that's what we document.
mhm, mhm. You brought up an interesting point, you know, the difference between when we talk, it seems what I guess is when we talk about an oral history, we're talking about a longer type of interview. When you talk about a memory project, it is one of those things. Tell us about. Yeah. So I see
Yeah,
that.
and yeah, generally has more people, shorter time frames.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Nick asks, and then Joy actually had put, do you have a sample permission form that you can share with us? In your handout, there is one, correct?
Yeah, I think there's 3 examples, and I just pulled some from reputable organizations, um, and you can kind of use that to build out um, one for yourself.
Great, great. And then does the library in of itself,
Mhm.
Houston Public, have an oral history recording room?
We don't have one here at HMRC. Um, we generally go to people's spaces, but we do have offices or particular rooms here that we generally use if they can't make it to our site.
Mhm.
Um, as far as spaces available for others, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that would work at like Central, and if those would
Mhm.
be quiet enough. Maybe that's something we
Yeah.
can discuss and
Especially,
look at.
well, yeah, I think so. I think, you know, in special collections, we can discuss that and offer it. Right now at Houston Public, our meeting rooms are not open, but there are study rooms, Nick. You asked that question. There are study rooms at some of the neighborhood libraries that you might be able to book, which is
Mhm.
like 1 or 2 people, if you needed a place to do that. And then what about using Zoom for remote interviewing? Have you had any experience with that? Or do you know anybody that has?
I have I have not, but the Baylor Institute for Oral History, there's a link again on that handout. They have a whole presentation there dedicated to, you know, COVID era remote interviewing. So they go over different platforms and what works best in different situations and based on the equipment that you have.
Mhm.
So they would be definitely the experts to talk about that, but I know it is possible.
And Joy, thank you. We actually also at the Houston Public Library have these locations called tech links.
Yes.
Nick mentioned actually asked if HPL has an equipment to digitize audio tapes. So at a few of our neighborhood libraries, there are things called tech links that have a lot of this equipment available that you can go and use. If you aren't in Houston, you might ask your library if maybe there are maker spaces. I think they call them sometimes too, Sam, huh?
Yes, and I know there's several programs. There's one like national program that's still in the early stages called Memory Lab, that some libraries across the country have that. And there are similar things, not always for every format of audio or visual material, but also photographs and other family memory things that can help you digitize those materials. So just Googling around for different areas. I know there are options additionally at Montgomery County and Harris County libraries.
Mhm, mhm. And Joy did put a link to our tech links in the chat. And then from Southern California, Los Angeles Central Library has a tech lab if you're interested and you live out that way. But again, you know, contact your library, contact maybe one of the archives in the area or your university library to see if there's spaces. Another comment is Paul mentioned, for transcripts, check out Otter, which is OTTER.ai. Otter.ai, it's in the chat also, to do a transcript that will need to be edited. So I'm not sure, are you familiar with Otter AI?
Not Otter. We've used various softwares over the years to try and do that. We've also did contracts out with, there are companies who just do transcription work. Some of them are like more medical based, but some of them definitely are geared towards oral histories and, you know, do transcripts for other recordings that academics use. So definitely search around. There's not one that I'm like, oh, this is the go-to, because you're always going to need to edit, especially for people's names, place names, things like that. Those are always going to need to be edited.
So Phyllis also asked, are these slides available for later reference? So yes, Phyllis and everyone, we are recording this presentation, and the Houston Public Library has a YouTube channel, and it may take a short period of time, a month or so maybe, to get this presentation up on our YouTube channel. But when you go to YouTube and search Houston Public, you'll see there's a link there. We are in the History Research Centers, and that's where you will find our presentation. And one last question, let alone, this is not, there have been plenty kudos, very informative, and thanking you very much for the knowledge in your presentation. But how do you, Sandra asks, how do you document these interviews and link them to your prior research? So I think that just what I can say is I think you can upload audio files to Family Search if you're using Family Search. And when you're documenting, Sam, how are you documenting?
Yeah, as far as on the library end, we have a digital website that we use, and ultimately all of our recordings get uploaded there. And any transcriptions or indexing that we do will be there. We also have the material backed up onto cloud storage as far as a preservation copy, so that, you know, we're not touching that very often or ever, but we know it's there in case of catastrophe. Using it in using it in promotions and things like that. We use it in presentations like this. Unfortunately, this is a very strange oral history presentation where I didn't play a clip of an oral history. I'm a little ashamed of myself now. But we use them all the time in presentations, and we get people who use them in podcasts. We've talked about that, but have not yet pursued that. But we know that they've been used in podcasts and documentaries frequently. So we don't do as much researching and things as Clayton does. Ours is very, you know, Houston focused, not so much oral history or you know, particularly family based. So we use it when it's relevant, or when we have something that'll complement it. Everything we have is by donation or someone that we've singled out. So if we have something, we'll use it to complement other things that we have, or to show that that's all we have. Myself, being the architectural archivist, we have a great collection of actually the built environment, but we have only a few things from landscape architects. So a project I did when I came in, and I guess it's still ongoing, but on a long pause, was interviewing landscape architects about recently completed projects. So here in Houston, we have Buffalo Bayou Park, McGovern Centennial Gardens, Levy Park, So I interviewed the landscape architects within about 5 years of the completion, and then hopefully 20, 25 years, we'll go back to those same architects and see how their perspectives have changed, how people are using the park has changed. So it's an ongoing project, but it's kind of filling a gap that we had. So hopefully that'll be fuller in the future.
It's interesting just to listen to you when you went over that project, because it's exactly what you did. What is the goal? What is the purpose of the project? And what's the follow-up? And what is the whole plan for the project? Because you have the inception interview, and then your plan is to go back to them. So there is a reason for what you're doing, I suppose, as you talked about. So there are another couple other comments. Carrie puts in forever.com has home use, for home use has audio storage. And then Barbara mentioned StoryCorps. StoryCorps is an oral history project by a company. StoryCorps is a non-for-profit organization, I guess. Sam, can you explain that a little?
Yeah, it's I think it's still an offshoot or a part of NPR, and it's generally a family member or a close friend of someone talking about, kind of like we talked about the memory projects, a little snapshot. Oral historians debate. It's not my subject area particular, but I am aware of their debate over whether those count. Of course, any kind of documentation is better than nothing, but I think they count. You're capturing someone's story. And
they count in genealogy too, Sam.
Yeah. Blame it on the folklore. And I think they're important stories to tell. And they get a heck of a lot more publicity than most oral histories. So kudos to them.
They do. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, if you do just Google StoryCorps, I am not sure if you can submit stories online. You very well might be able to. And then they are housed at the Library of Congress, from what I understand. And if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but I haven't looked at their website in a while. But well, Sam, I think we have come to the end of our questions, other than a lot of thank yous. Joy did put a link in our previous recordings in the chat. And to save the chat, if you guys are interested, if you look down on the bottom where you would enter a chat question, there are 3 dots. And if you click on those 3 dots, you will have the option to save the chat, and then you will get all these links. And some other ideas that everyone has shared with us. So, Sam, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. No dots on your phone. Well, I don't know what to tell you about the dots on your phone. Justin, do you have anything that you can help us with about saving it on the phone?
If there should be a function to save, it should be at the top. There should be 3 bars, and when you click on it, it should pull out the chat function and you can save.
Okay, so there should be 3 bars on the phone. Thank you, Justin. And once again, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Justin and Joy. Oh, Barbara says no bars. Well, Barbara, I will give you our phone number, which is 832-393-2600. If anybody has any bars or dots, okay, well, by all means, our phone number is 832-393-2600. Thank you, Joy. And if you call us and ask us to save the chat or to send you the chat, we can do that. So call and ask for me, and I'm Sue, and I have saved the chat. So call and ask for me, and we'll exchange, get your email, and then we can send it. Okay. Sam, thank you again. Justin, Joy, thank you. Thank you all, everyone, for coming, and please have a safe and wonderful holiday and get those stories, right? Thank you, everyone. Sam,
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. All right. Bye-bye.